My name is Karen. Today, the new branch of my husband's family's restaurant chain just opened in Chicago, a classy space decorated with bunches of white baby's breath tinged with lavender, a menu I personally curated down to the last dish. Grilled lobster with garlic butter, imported white wine from Napa, and lemon tart for dessert. I picked the chair colors, checked the lighting, made sure everything was flawless. But once the guests started arriving, my role shrank to two tasks: checking the payment receipts and cleaning up abandoned glasses. The spotlight, the credit for landing the famous food critic, was handed entirely to Logan and Emily. My in-laws beamed like they had saved the entire Chicago culinary scene, toasting to Logan and Emily without once glancing my way. I stood in a corner where the light didn't reach, surrounded by the aroma of gourmet food and soft jazz music, feeling like an old object mistakenly placed on a newly set table. I remembered the way my in-laws used to look at me, that fleeting glance like I was still the poor girl from the suburbs, from the creaky old wooden house where my parents had never even seen a bottle of Napa wine. Logan and Emily, with their stories of elite private schools and summers in the Hamptons, had always been the shining stars in their eyes. Michael, my husband, sat at the center table, giving me a tight, awkward smile before quickly dropping his eyes to his phone. I knew that look. He saw, but had no intention of speaking. As dinner was wrapping up, Emily's gaze swept across the room and landed on me, like she had just remembered someone else was there. She raised her glass with a smirk and said, "Karen. What's it like being the useless one?" My in-laws chuckled. Logan burst out laughing. Their laughter sliced into me like razors. Michael lowered his head, fingers tightening around his wine glass, but he said nothing. His silence hurt more than Emily's words. My heart clenched, suffocated by everything left unsaid. I took a deep breath and slowly stood up. In the middle of that crowded room, I looked straight at Emily, my voice not loud, but clear enough to still the air. Useless? Then who kept this restaurant from being seized by the bank? The wine paused midair in Logan's hand. A flicker of panic crossed Emily's face. I gently placed my napkin on the plate, a small action, but it echoed like thunder. Then I walked away, each click of my heels on the wooden floor marking my exit from the role of the dutiful daughter-in-law. Michael watched me go, his eyes filled with worry, but he didn't stand. Not once. And I understood. I wasn't just walking out of that room. I was walking out of a place where I had never been truly seen. And this time, I wouldn't come back. I walked out of that party, but the question kept echoing in my head. Since when did I become useless? Since when did everything I did turn invisible? The bitter cold of Chicago wrapped itself around the collar of my thin coat. I stopped at the curb, beneath the flickering neon light of a closed bakery, and the memories came rushing back like pages being flipped in reverse. I remembered 2018, a year that was supposed to be a turning point for me. I had been offered a mid-level position at an international hotel management company in New York, with a clear path to director within 3 years. They sent a confirmation email with the contract attached, and I printed it out, placed it on the table by the window, where the afternoon sun hit the words, "Welcome to our team, Ms. Karen." But at the same time, my husband's family restaurant was spiraling. Revenue had plummeted after a food safety scandal at one of the old branches, and the bank threatened foreclosure unless they paid off a $120,000 loan within 3 months. Michael looked at me with exhausted eyes. My in-laws called every day, their voices tense, almost begging. I folded the contract, placed it in a drawer. I never signed it. I used my entire $100,000 in savings, the money I had scraped together piece by piece from every shift that left me drained. I went to the bank, signed bridge loan papers, and personally went to buy the industrial oven they needed because the old one had been broken for over a month, and no one had taken care of it. I remember the first night the restaurant reopened after the crisis. I stood in the kitchen, shirt soaked in sweat, holding the ingredient list in one hand, reading numbers aloud to balance the books. Meanwhile, the whole family was outside, hosting a soft opening party like the crisis had never happened. I wasn't invited to sit at the table, but I smiled anyway, thinking, I'll just be the one holding things up from the back. I paid staff salaries for 2 straight months, with my personal credit card. I had the utilities redirected to my account. At one point, it was just me and a young chef left in the kitchen, so tired we collapsed at the table. And then one day, when my in-laws came to review the books, I handed them the latest financial report. They nodded and said only one thing. Good. You're a great support. Not daughter-in-law. Not the one who saved us. Just support. Like I was some temp who happened to be stuck with extra tasks. Michael knew everything. One night in the restaurant kitchen, while I was checking invoices, he stood behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder. Thank you, he whispered, so softly it was like he was afraid someone might hear. But he never said anything in front of the family. Never stood up for me. In 2019, I got an email from accounting. It said my in-laws had transferred 20% of the restaurant shares to Logan and Emily as a reward for their new vision. No one asked me. No one mentioned me. I sat frozen in the office, staring at my computer screen, unable to type a word. I was the one who kept the place alive, but I wasn't worth acknowledging. I told myself that maybe that's just what daughters-in-law are supposed to do, carry the burden, sacrifice, and stay quiet. Until one evening, my phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice was sweet in a way that made your guard go up, like a kid saying, I was just playing. Karen, she began, do you think you could help the family borrow $200,000? We're planning to open a new branch, and it's not like you're doing much besides sitting in the office counting money, right? I remember sitting up straight, my hand tightening around the phone. Every word she said squeezed my throat tighter. I took a breath, then replied, calm but clear. No, Emily, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I won't borrow a single cent for you. And you know what? I own 60% of the restaurant shares through the contract signed in 2020 silence. I heard her inhale, like she'd just been hit with a bucket of cold water. In 2020, when the restaurant was once again on the verge of being seized by the bank, I negotiated an extension on the debt and invested an additional $250,000 from my personal investment fund, money I had saved to start a small studio of my own. My in-laws signed over 60% of the shares to me just because they needed the money immediately. Maybe they didn't remember, or maybe they didn't want to. Emily let out a short laugh. Are you serious? The family won't be happy. I gave a dry chuckle. Ask your parents. I have the contract, the paperwork, the proof. On the other end of the line, I heard the longest silence I've ever experienced in a phone call. Then Emily hung up without saying a word. That night, I told Michael. He looked at me, a little panicked, like he was afraid of how angry the family would be. If you do this, they'll lose it. I nodded. I know. I paid the debt, covered payroll, kept this place running, and they called me useless. I've had enough. He stayed quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. You deserve respect. I'm sorry I didn't say that sooner. For the first time in years, he looked at me without turning away. And even though that support came late, it was still enough to lighten the weight inside me. Like someone had finally seen it. I wasn't just a shadow. I was Karen. And I saved the empire they thought only men could steer. A week after the party, I called for a family meeting at the headquarters office. No restaurant, no guests, no wine. Just a long oak table, 6 chairs, and me, with a black document case resting on my lap. My in-laws sat at the head of the table, faces stern like they were expecting a business report. Emily, in a turquoise cashmere sweater, had her arms crossed, eyes cold. Logan sat next to her, fiddling with his phone, the corner of his mouth curved like it was all some kind of joke. Michael quietly pulled out the chair next to me. I didn't look at him. Once everyone was seated, I opened the case. The click of the lock echoed, sharp and cold. I pulled out a stack of papers and placed them in the center of the table. I didn't speak at first. I just looked. Logan raised an eyebrow, but it was the soft thud of the papers hitting the table that made him flinch. I began reading, line by line, number by number, not fast, as if each word carried its own weight. $350,000 from my personal account was used to pay off the restaurant's debt in 2018. $100,000 initial investment. $250,000 more in 2020 during restructuring. All transfer receipts, ownership certificates, negotiation records, they're all here. I slid a copy of the 2020 ownership agreement across the table. I'm not just the support. I own 60% of this restaurant chain. And from today, I have the right to decide its future. Emily turned pale. Her red lips moved but formed no words. My in-laws looked at each other, eyes shifting like they were trying to find an escape route between truth and pride. Logan tried to laugh it off. "Karen, you're blowing this way out of proportion." I cut in, gently but firmly. "I'm just stating facts. If the truth feels too big, it's only because you've tried to bury it for too long." Emily slammed her hand on the table, almost shouting, "These documents are fake. Who do you think you are, Karen? Some poor girl who thinks she can control this family just because she saved a little money?" I gave a faint smile and pushed the contract toward her. "No, Emily. I'm the person who owns 60% of this chain, and I don't need a fancy background to prove that." My mother-in-law lowered her head, fingers nervously running along her pearl necklace, like she was trying to find a place to hide. Then Michael stood up, the wooden chair scraping behind him. He took a deep breath, his voice shaky but steady. "Karen has done more than anyone here. It's time we acknowledge that." His words landed like a stone dropped in a still pond, sending waves through the room. Emily turned to him, eyes wide. "Michael, are you taking her side?" But he didn't answer. He just looked at me, his eyes full of apology and resolve. I gave him a small nod, feeling like an invisible thread between us had just tightened. Without another word, I turned, leaving the folder on the table, evidence, contracts, and years of being dismissed, right there on the polished wood. Then I walked out. I didn't look back. In the days that followed, the air in the house felt heavy, like the sky over Chicago before a storm. Emily and Logan bombarded me with messages, some threatening, some begging. "Karen, you can't do this to the family." One of Emily's texts flashed on my screen. The words rushed like she was screaming. Then they took it further. Logan and Emily filed a lawsuit, accusing me of taking advantage of their vulnerable moment to secure majority ownership. I wasn't shocked, just quietly amused. They even attached a so-called forged email from me, saying I would return the shares once things stabilized. But it was written in a font I never used, and they didn't know I had saved the entire negotiation log with the bank. Every call, every email, every memo signed by a third party. My lawyer, Margot, a sharp woman with eyes like a magnifying glass, stood before the judge and laid everything out in under 10 minutes. No argument, no defense, just truth, neatly filed and page numbered. The judge dismissed the case. Brief, no appeal. I didn't celebrate. I just went home and, within a week, withdrew all capital and shares from the restaurant chain. The business began to shake. Bills piled up. Staff started quitting. Emily sent me a stream of messages, first blaming, then pleading, then furious. "You're destroying everything, Karen," she wrote. I didn't reply. My in-laws called 3 times, leaving long voicemails about family and duty. I deleted them all. I'd heard enough. That night, in our small apartment, Michael pulled me into his arms. The light from the window hit his face, revealing wrinkles I'd never noticed before. "I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long," he said, voice low and sincere. "I was wrong not to stand up for you. From now on, I'm with you, no matter what." I nodded, tears falling quietly down my cheeks. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I hadn't just freed myself from his family's burden. I had found a true partner. D4. After the lawsuit, I never set foot in the old restaurant again. I didn't even lift my eyes when driving past the building. Instead, I started each morning with a blank notebook. For the first time in my life, I had the chance to make plans for myself. I enrolled in a restaurant management course at a small culinary school in Chicago. No one knew who I was, and I didn't tell them. Every evening, I put on a thick coat, slung on my backpack, and walked through snow-dusted blocks to class. The class wasn't big, maybe 10 people, but the scent of butter melting in copper pans, the sound of knives slicing through onions, the overhead light reflecting off stainless steel counters, it all made me feel alive again. I learned to make risotto, the proper way, ladle by ladle, stirring arborio rice until it was as smooth as velvet. Every time I finished a dish, it didn't feel like I was learning to cook. I was learning how to be patient with myself. I hired a young chef, Mateo, 27, hair tied up, round glasses, obsessed with white truffles. We began designing the dream restaurant menu: crusty bread, slow-simmered white bean soup, herb-crusted seared tuna, and panna cotta for dessert. I no longer used Excel to calculate crises. I used it to design experiences, from flavor to lighting. Michael, for the first time, asked if he could join me for a class. I was surprised. He had never spent more than 15 minutes in the kitchen. But he came, learned to chop onions without crying, made bechamel sauce without lumps, and stayed up late helping me test recipes. One night, when I tasted his pasta, slightly salty, a bit too rich, I looked at him and laughed. Not bad, for a beginner. He looked at me, still holding the spoon, and softly said, "I've wanted you to live like this for so long." I didn't say anything, but something in my chest softened. One night, I stood in front of the mirror in our apartment, wearing a new white apron, the logo, Karen's Table, stitched small on the chest. I looked into my own eyes, no longer tired, no longer doubtful. I touched the apron, feeling the rough fabric under my fingertips, and smiled. Relief spread through my chest. I looked at myself for a long time. No longer the quiet support. No longer the daughter-in-law in the background of bigger chairs. I was Karen. And I was building something of my own. Every dish, every decision, every scent from my own hands. I placed my hand over my chest, felt my heartbeat, steady, not frantic, not uncertain. Just peace. 3 years later, when the restaurant chain bearing my name, Karen's Table, had 3 locations in Chicago, I received an invitation to speak at a women entrepreneurs conference. That year's theme: Redefining Success. They said they'd followed my journey, from the moment I left the family restaurant to the opening of the South Loop branch and the Food magazine interview last month. And now they wanted me to tell my story. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to ask myself, if I told it, what would I say? That I was once called useless? That I once stood in a room full of lights and still felt invisible? Or that I once placed a black folder on a table and pulled back an entire restaurant empire that had never once said my name? On the day of the conference, I stood on a small stage, the light shining from behind me, casting a long shadow across the gray fabric backdrop. I wore a pale cream suit, no jewelry, carrying only a pen, the same kind I had once used to sign the ownership contract in 2020. I spoke about the years when no one acknowledged me, about the lemon tart at that party, and about the moment I walked out of that meeting room without needing to shout for someone to listen. I never asked for power, I said. I only asked for my name back. I looked down at Michael. He was the first to applaud, strong and resounding, followed by the entire room breaking into applause, not loud, but genuine. After the talk, a young woman, early 30s, eyes still wet, approached me. She hugged me, without asking, without introducing herself, and whispered softly into my ear. "Your story makes me want to say no to my boss." I squeezed her hand lightly. No advice needed, no slogans, just knowing that my voice, finally, had become the echo someone else needed to hear. Just as I once needed it, through all those silent years. That morning, I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. The streets of Chicago were still misty, the sun slow to rise, its light soft as a silk scarf draped over the buildings. I carried a bundle of fresh lavender, the kind I used to place at old parties, the ones no one remembered, and this time I arranged them myself in a small vase by the window. Karen's table had just opened its 4th location, and in the quiet before opening hours, I could hear the espresso machine humming softly, my assistant's pen gliding across the reservation calendar, and my own breathing. No longer rushed, no longer uncertain. Michael was folding napkins. He no longer sat at the center of someone else's party. He chose to work beside me, quietly, the way I once worked for his family. We didn't say much, just exchanged a glance, as if all the words had already been spoken years ago, and now we were simply living the rest of it, the part where neither of us had to prove anything anymore. I opened the glass door, letting the light flood in. The scent of toasted bread floated in with the breeze. The little bell on the door rang softly like a ritual marking the start of a new day. I looked up at the wooden sign hanging outside. Karen's table. Deep brown, rounded letters lit by the morning gold, each stroke clear and strong. It wasn't just a name. It was proof that I had once existed quietly, had once been dismissed, had once walked in empty-handed but full-hearted. And now I had built a table of my own, not to compete, but to be present, not to be invited to sit, but to invite myself. I used to think my value was in what I gave. Now I know. My value is me.